Indigenous people. So it now gives me very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Fred Cahir, who's going to talk about black gold, Indigenous people's role on the Central Victorian Goldfields. Fred is Associate Professor in Aboriginal History at Federation University, and Fred lives and works on Wadawurrung country, and his Masters and PhD focused on local Victorian Aboriginal history. Fred is an extremely prolific researcher, having published 7 books and numerous articles. And his most recent book publication is My Country All Gone, The White Men Have Stolen It, The Invasion of Wadawurrung Country, 1800 to 1870. And for those of you who are interested, some of Fred's other books include Black Gold, The Role of Aboriginal People on the Goldfields of Victoria, The Aboriginal Story of Burke and Wills, Forgotten Narratives, and Aboriginal Biocultural Knowledge in Southeastern Australia. So now it gives me very great pleasure to hand over to you, Fred.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Are we live? We good to go?
We are.
Oh, excellent. As Ruth noted, one of my my PhD was titled Black Gold, Aboriginal People in the Goldfields of Victoria, and published a book on that title through ANU Press back in 2012. So Ruth has asked me to present some information from that book. As Ruth noted, I'm living and working on Wadawurrung country, so I'd like to acknowledge past and present, and I'm very grateful to be living and working on Wadawurrung country, even in the middle of winter. We see in that reconstruction map that the Victorian languages and clans that I'll be talking about predominantly in central Victoria. We have another map just to demonstrate some of the major goldfields that I'll be mentioning throughout the presentation.
Fred, can I just ask you to share your screen?
Yeah, sure can. Is that better?
Yes, that's fantastic.
Okay.
You might just want to go back one slide so people can see your book title.
Oh, yep. Okay. So the title of the book was Black Gold, Aboriginal People in the Goldfields of Victoria, and it was published through ANU ePress. Available for free if you download it. So this is a map of some of the central highland, or predominantly central Victorian goldfields that I'll be speaking about in this presentation. Close on a decade ago, I began researching about gold mining and Aboriginal people, focusing exclusively on Victoria. At the time, I must confess, I thought that this was going to be one of the shortest PhDs in world history. The common perceptions at that period of time, at least, was that Aboriginal people were on the periphery of the goldfields, that they were bewildered about gold mining in general. And if we did know anything about Aboriginal people and gold mining in Victoria, generally those ideas were of a very negative nature. It wasn't an overall rosy sort of picture that I entered into this research field. So I just want to, in effect, dispel some of those ideas, as certainly from a colonial artist point of view, I was very quickly discovering that Aboriginal people most definitely were not on the periphery. That in many instances, they were at the forefront, in fact, as we'll see throughout the presentation. So I'm going to be using just images to talk to the images, in effect, in this presentation, because I found so many, and B, I think you know, the old cliche, but it's true, an image says 1,000 words. This one is Mount Alexander from the Sawpit diggings, somewhere in the mid 1850s. We see the Djadjurrung people very much at the forefront in these illustrations. This one is taken from the Ballarat Goldfields in 1851. So right at the outset of the gold rush, we see Aboriginal people featuring very prominently. In fact, just you know, before the gold rush officially began in 1851, we have both visual and, well, when I say visual, map records that Aboriginal people were featuring in the rush for gold in 1849, 2 years before the official gold rush begun. The native police, as they were called, who were stationed at Daisy Creek, I think it is, from memory, were busy finding as much gold as anybody else was on that very short-lived goldfield. This is a painting by Tom Roper of the Ararat Goldfields, again showing, I've circled them in the illustration that you can see, again at the forefront of the diggings. And it wasn't just in the visual images. I must confess that when I began this research, I was thinking perhaps the Goldfields artists, the non-Indigenous Goldfields artists, were plonking them in, as a technical term for you, into the images for a bit of exotica, so to speak. But I consulted with the well, the Goldfields artists' diaries and journals and letters and reminiscences themselves, and a multitude of, and I mean multitude of, miners' reminiscences, diaries, and government records, and the text of the non-Indigenous miners and others certainly plays out, demonstrates that they most definitely were not just placed into these artists' renditions as a piece of exotica. They were rendering the Aboriginal people as they saw them in real life, in real terms, so to speak. I found this image a very interesting image for a number of reasons. This is Ballarat in 1854. The National Library, where I first saw this, had no, they didn't know the provenance, who painted it or when it was painted or where it was. And we did a bit of detective work, and in the background, you probably can't see it on your screens, but in the background, you can see a lineup of red-coated soldiers. We know that the redcoats were in Ballarat in that sort of number, that large number, with a police camp in the background for a very short period of time, a very famous period of time that we all know of, the Eureka Stockade. So we can literally picture that these two Wathrung people walking down what's now called Main Road in Ballarat were in the actual scene of the Eureka, were in the vicinity, were very much aware, obviously, of what was happening on the Ballarat Goldfields during the Eureka Stockade. So I'm stressing that point because clearly they're not on the periphery. Clearly they're, as I'll demonstrate in a moment, they weren't bewildered. They were an active and not a passive at all part of the Goldfields scenery and community and activity. It was, again, much to my surprise, I must confess, that Aboriginal people had a great familiarity with the concept of mining. A lot of historians and writers over the past century and a half have, in effect, dismissed Aboriginal people's involvement in gold mining, not just here in Victoria, but across Australia, for a number of reasons that they tout. But again, the pictorial and the textual evidence would suggest, well, not suggest, would demonstrate, I would argue, that, again, nothing could be further from the truth. We know that, for instance, that Aboriginal people across Australia quarried for precious stone, including greenstone in this part of southeastern Australia, ochres, quartz, and crystals as well. We also know that Aboriginal people, in their search, in their hunt, I should say, for certain animals, including wombat, as in this illustration, hunted them using literally a tunnel shaft sort of method, as you can see in this illustration. So the concept of mining was not a foreign concept to them. They were certainly not bewildered spectators, as some historians have painted Aboriginal people, about the spectacle of gold mining. Certainly the scale of the gold mining that occurred in central Victoria certainly would have been bewildering. Was bewildering, I should emphasize, for the non-Indigenous people as well. This is an interesting painting of Ararat. You can see in the foreground again the Jabberung people. George Rao, who produced this painting, described in his letters back to his mother in England how he sought out the Jabberung when he was mining and painting on Jabberung country, and the Jabberung when he was on Jabberung country. He sought them out as guides to get to distant goldfields, remembering that Aboriginal people had that knowledge of country that the non-Indigenous miners clearly didn't, especially newbies, as we would call them in 2020, greenhorn miners, as they were called in the 19th century. Just want to pay a little bit more attention to this painting because it shows the environmental degradation that was impacting the whole of central Victoria. To give you an idea of how devastating the environmental impact was, one miner described how every tree, quote, "every tree is felled, every feature of nature is annihilated," was his comment about the area around the Castlemaine goldfields. Those of you who might be living in Kilmore now, miners had some very disparaging remarks about Kilmore in particular. They really laid into the Kilmore goldfields. There was maggots wriggling on corruption, was how one miner, non-Indigenous miner, described the Kilmore goldfields. The environmental destruction just really can't be emphasized enough. That Aboriginal people were literally reeling from this sort of devastation, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. The social disruption that the gold also brought, again, is a very prominent feature of both the literature and the visual record. And we see here a couple of the illustrations of sly grog out in the bush. It was certainly occurring everywhere across Victoria during the gold rush period. I used to think that, I still do, that we do have a chronic alcohol and drug problem in 2020 in contemporary Australia and Victoria. The 19th century was no different. Slightly bemusing, but in a sick sort of way. I recall reading an advertisement in a Ballarat newspaper in the 1850s, proudly exhorting its particular, their own brand of alcohol that they had developed and were commercially selling on the goldfields. It was called "Blow Your Bloody Head Off," was the name of its brew, this local brew. And then it illustrated how it would blow your literal bloody head off by listing the ingredients in the alcohol. Some of the ingredients were cayenne pepper, pure alcohol, opium, and the list went on. That kind of explained for me why I was reading so many accounts of Indigenous and non-Indigenous miners who met their death literally from a one-night bender on such a frequent occasion. The alcohol was, didn't have the same standardization, obviously, that it has in 2020. So going out on a binge like we see in these illustrations was not exactly a wise move for your health, and definitely not from a social point of view. It caused a lot of social disintegration, both particularly from an Indigenous point of view, but also from a non-Indigenous point of view. We tend to think that gold mining was loved by everyone and was seen as a boom and a boon by everyone, but this was far from the case. There were a lot of critics of the gold rush and what it would bring to a stable Christian society in 19th century Victoria. And the negative effects most certainly did arrive and have enormous impact. I want to also delve into just quickly how I've used this diagram to try and demonstrate that in some ways, not sort of not too many ways, but in some ways, the gold rush and what was created in terms of the need for Aboriginal knowledge was not necessarily out of sync with Aboriginal kinship practices, which we know are the cornerstone of their society. So their traditional knowledges were put to great use. The historians, as I noted at the start of this presentation, have tended to place Aboriginal people not only at the peripheral of the but also at a point where they had no agency, that they were just passive recipients of the violence and the social dislocation, and simply sort of in a sense shrunk away from this great epoch that enveloped central Victoria. I like as my fellow historian, or he's sadly passed away, Weston Bate, described gold as a democratic mineral. And for quite a period of time, I thought, yes, democratic for some, but not for Aboriginal people. But in some degree, we see, I would argue, that the gold rush in particular, particularly the first 10 years of the gold rush, the alluvial gold rush, can be likened to, I would argue, to, many would argue this perhaps, their Aboriginal people's involvement, say, in the Second World War and other epochs of that sort of nature, where Aboriginal people for a period of time were actually allowed, if you like, to participate on an equal footing with the non-Indigenous people. Their need, non-Indigenous people's need for Aboriginal people's knowledge and skills and participation gave Aboriginal people this window of opportunity to be on as equal footing as they possibly could in the white mainstream colonial economy. Let's have a look at why I'm suggesting that. Certainly, the colonial artists, Goldfields artists' illustrations indicate, or sort of to some degree demonstrate that a sense of, I wouldn't say equality, but certainly a greater sense of enabling Aboriginal people to participate at a much equal level than in other periods before or after the gold rush period. We see them in and amongst the white miners, in their tents, in their huts, alongside them on the gold rush, sort of moments that occurred throughout, particularly the 1850s. I want you to, if you can, take note. You may not be able to read it. I'll read it for you. The title of this illustration is Australian Life, a party of diggers joining a native encampment. I don't want to be too postmodernist. I barely know how to spell postmodernism, let alone adhere to much of it. But I'm just intrigued that this and other illustrations of its ilk, I think, clearly demonstrate that the diggers themselves, again in their letters and reminiscences and diaries and memoirs, clearly demonstrate that they were keen to acquire the knowledge that Aboriginal people had. What was that knowledge? The knowledge was to find gold, primarily. You also had to feed yourself, find water, find your way to the next gold field, as in be led or guided to it, and a few other things that I'll talk about in just a moment. Just by way of example of how avidly non-Indigenous miners would seek out Aboriginal people, the one gold rush was started in one town by the admission of of non-Aboriginal miners themselves. This was at Rushworth that I'm speaking of. They showed a group of would have been Djadjurrung women a matchbox full of little gold nuggets, and asked them, "Do you know where where we can find more of these?" And the Djadjurrung women were, so the miners said, kind of laughed and quickly went over to a field and pulled up some kangaroo grass, and there were gold nuggets contained within the roots of the grass. That they were fully aware. The Aboriginal people were fully aware of what gold was, where to find it, and sort of how to sustain yourself on a gold field. So these were, as you could probably, I'm hoping you can imagine, were key skills to have when you're coming from Europe, have no idea of how to survive in the Australian environment, where initially at least there was very little infrastructure for European miners. I want to concentrate on just 5 areas, if I may. They are finding gold, guiding, the policing of the goldfields, trading in both cultural and material culture and non-material culture, and also what I'm terming performance tourism. These are just 5 areas that I find of particular interest in terms of that really clearly demonstrate Aboriginal involvement in the goldfields of Central Victoria in particular. Before we leave this slide, you can see the native, well, hopefully you can see just the head of the native policeman on his horse, in the background, I suppose you could say. And the title of this artist's depiction is "Sly Grog Selling at the Diggings Effectually Stopped." The native police were had been operating off and on for the previous decade during the pastoral period, as it's called, the sheep period, wool period, and when the gold rush commenced proper in 1851, Governor Latrobe acknowledged that the native police were the only police that he had at his disposal to maintain peace and order on the goldfields. We have these lovely illustrations from William Strutt and S.T. Gill and many other goldfields artists that place Aboriginal people really right at the forefront of finding gold. And it's interesting to note that again, thanks to Trove, we have such an abundance of material now that really does consolidate those diaries and memoirs that I've been speaking of. And some of the, I suppose, it's great as a historian to, have those funny moments when you're doing research. And one such moment, if I can share with you about Aboriginal people finding gold, is like people everywhere when they come across a, sort of effectually, winning Tats Lotto, or, was like finding gold was effectually like that. That a group of Djadjurrung miners had found an extraordinary amount of gold. And this occurred on a very frequent basis. So the newspaper accounts would tell us. And it was such an abundance, such a great find that they were, went out immediately. So the newspaper report said, purchased a team of horses and a carriage, dressed themselves up in bell topper hats and the women in crinolines, and then proceeded to do a 19th century version of laps around town, sort of woohoo. So it's, we see, that wasn't a solitary occurrence, I should emphasize. I most definitely am not just cherry picking. We could, sit in here for an hour and just go through newspaper, trove article after trove article and memoirs and reminiscence extracts to as a clear indication that Aboriginal people were both independent miners as parties just on them by themselves, fossicking, and also, I think, rather remarkably, some evidence of them quartz mining as well. So an extraordinary amount of the actual being participants in actively searching for gold. This is there were many writers who were publishing guide to the Goldfields, particularly guide to the Victorian Goldfields, books and newspaper articles and pamphlets and so forth. And this is the cover illustration of one such 19th century book. And we see just in the cover 3 instances of Aboriginal people, both presumably independently, forming parties and collaborative parties, and just passerbyers as well. So again, trying to emphasize their active presence on the goldfields. One Goldfields writer talking about, by way of example, talking about the Eureka Rebellion, which was obviously a point of great interest for all readers. This was one of the most epochal sort of moments in British history. We had people like Karl Marx commenting on the Eureka Rebellion, saying, to quote Karl Marx, saying that this was the start of the the workers' revolution, that would envelop the world. So the Eureka Rebellion was a big topic, as we all know, especially coming from Ballarat. Of course, I'm going to say that. What I'm driving at is that one miner talking about the miners' flag in 1854, talking about the making of the design of the miners' flag, commented that the Aboriginal flag, now we don't know which Aboriginal flag he's talking about in 1854, he said, quote unquote, the Aboriginal flag should be included in the miners' rebellion flag. So we have a really clear, I would argue, defining features, placing Aboriginal people very much at the forefront of events, not just in the actual mining, but in the social milieu as well. As I mentioned before, the role of the native police cannot be understated. Some historians, including myself, have argued that there was the native police were prominent in the how shall I put it, the quelling, I suppose, is probably the best way to put it, of insurrection that was occurring on the Ballarat Goldfields a year before the stockade, that the Captain Dana, the commander of the native police, thought was going to erupt into a general riot, and the native police were effectually doing their job, and they were the police force that Dana and the others were using to enforce the law and order and the paying of licenses. This was not just a show pony sort of position that they had. You can get a clear idea of the active job that they did through William Strutt's beautiful illustration of a white miner being led by the native troopers to Melbourne for not having paid his license. During as most of you probably may be aware, that during the gold rush there was a general exodus of citizens across the globe, effectively, and including sheep stations and including Melbourne. People just left their normal positions, whether you were a surgeon or a baker, or whatever your job was. When we say the gold rush, that's not a underestimation of that actual phrase. It was people spoke of it in terms of physically, as in a fever, that people were actually had a sickness for finding gold, that they gave up relationships, they gave up their jobs, they gave up careers, they gave up their social standing in the rush for gold, leaving this vacuum off the goldfields, particularly on the sheep stations. And we see in some of the ledges of the sheep stations, particularly in central Victoria, that Aboriginal people made up 50% on some sheep stations of the labour force. So they were washing the sheep, shearing the sheep, putting out the bushfires, putting up the fences, doing all the tasks that were required on a sheep station. So not only on the actual goldfields, but off the goldfields, they played such a really prominent role that really has not received much attention at all. One of my favorite paintings is Eugene von Gerard. What a splendid artist. I really love him to bits. But the pinnacle for me, I suppose, is held at the Geelong Fine Art Gallery, often called the Barter, that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. I particularly like it. Again, try not to be too postmodernist, but the white miner down on one knee, sort of in a begging type of posture, and the dominant Aboriginal sellers, sort of vendors, selling possum skin cloaks, is what you can see in between them. That the white miner presumably is inspecting the possum skin cloak, and the Aboriginal people. This is on the road to the Ballarat diggings down on the Barwon River, that von Gerard depicted this action scene of trade. And it really, the title Barter is a real mistake, really. We know that Aboriginal people very quickly grasped the monetary economy of the whites, very, very quickly, right from the outset of colonisation. And the goldfields was no exception. We know through numerous accounts that they were not trading them just for bartering them for tobacco and sugar and sort of minor trifles. That often these possum skin rugs went for anywhere between £2 and £5 each. George Rowe, the Goldfields artist, by way of example, purchased a possum skin rug from the Jajurong people for £3. We have examples of those beautiful possum skin cloaks from the William Strutt painting on the left of a Wathaurong woman in Ballarat in the early 1850s. These were highly sought after material culture that the Aboriginal people traded extensively in. One of the more, I think, one of the more interesting and exciting from a heritage tourism in 2020, or probably 2021, considering COVID point of view, is the performance tourism. I would call it the earliest form of nascent heritage tourism, colonial heritage tourism in Australia. We have many instances in the pre-gold period of Aboriginal people putting on corroborees. In fact, insisting on white squatters at that point in time and their families to come and witness the Aboriginal ceremonies, or corroborees as we often call them. And in the gold mining period, we have just a mountain of evidence from mechanics institutes to theatres to hotels to public venues such as Lake Wendouree. We have accounts of Aboriginal people literally parading through towns, including Smarsdale and Inglewood and others, saying, like shouting announcements of there's going to be a corroboree. And the next day, putting on the corroboree and demanding money for their cultural tourism performance. I suppose I find it amazing that in the 1860s we see I call it a morphing, if you like, of cultural tourism. You got to remember the Goldfields were pretty boring places in the main. So if you weren't a drinker, it was a very boring place until the mainstream sort of theatres, really started to take hold. And Aboriginal people were. There are instances in Ballarat, and I know in Bendigo as well, whereby Aboriginal people were entering into relationships with entrepreneurs, white entrepreneurs, to have this what I call a fusion tourism experience. Of the whites would organise, for by way of example, for fireworks display, and then Aboriginal people would come on and put on their corroboree, and the general admittance fee into these places. And very generous miners paying handsomely for these spectacular performances as they were described. I think I've finished just on time, which is amazing for me.
Well, thank you very much, Fred, for a really engaging presentation. If you could join me in thanking Fred, either with your reactions or anything else. And we'll now open it up to questions. So while you're thinking of questions, I'm just going to read one question from the chat for you, Fred. One question relates to these wider ideas that were circulating through those with power at the same time as the production of these images. How might government policy and the colonial community attitudes be reflected in these images? Obviously, erasure of an Aboriginal presence on the Goldfields wasn't part of the role of the artists or publications at this time. Is this common to representations from wider Australia at the time? And then a kind of an addition, postmodernism isn't something to simply dismiss. I'd argue that it offers valid tools for unpacking the representation of Aboriginality as described through paintings made by Europeans and the colonising culture.
I knew I was asking for trouble by bagging postmodernists.
Maybe you can start with the first part of the question, Fred, just about how government policy and colonial community attitudes are reflected in the images.
Yes, I had a hard time, by way of answering that, I had a hard time choosing the images for this presentation because there literally are hundreds, if not thousands, is probably closer to thousands. They most definitely, some artists most definitely did use them as exotica. Some did use them to because they knew that the images would sell better if they incorporated Aboriginal figures in the artwork. George Rao actually acknowledged this, that he sought out Aboriginal people out on the goldfields because he was told, he was making a living, as many, such as Eugene Bongerard and Rao and others, who were failed gold miners, and they turned back to their artwork to sustain themselves. And so they knew there was this pseudo-scientific interest in Aboriginal people in general, particularly in Europe, but also in Australia, that it was, so they had a vested interest in portraying Aboriginal people in their illustrations, I would argue. And there was also thrown into that mix, you have a lot of the Goldfields community were well educated, a fair number of them were well educated, and they had a much more, dare I say, a more liberal, small L liberal attitude towards Aboriginal place in society. They certainly were not devoid of sort of racial sort of notions, but they certainly were much more sympathetic, by and large, I would argue, than the previous generation of the squatting period. So hopefully I've answered that question, that there were sort of vested interests in these illustrations.
Just another question from the chat, Fred. Why do you think it became the accepted notion that Aboriginal people were just bewildered bystanders, peripheral non-participants in the gold rush? Is it because it's easier to justify the invasion and theft of their land if they can be portrayed as simple or primitive and therefore undeserving?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a good question because it really goes to the heart of how we represent Aboriginal people's involvement in epochs such as the Goldfields, in 2020. And it was really interesting to note that up to Federation, you can almost draw a line in the sand, so, to use a metaphor, that Aboriginal people were seen as, in most of the texts that I looked at, as active agents and actors in the events that occurred. And post 1900, the historians basically surgically excised them out of those events. I'll give you a really good example of that. There's an illustration that shows the redcoats coming in force into Ballarat, to quell the Eureka Stockade. And it's an image that any Ballarat persons, most Ballarat people are probably aware of. And in a original illustration of it, before it was doctored post 1901, it shows an Aboriginal person at the forefront, sort of looking on and watching the redcoats, coming into Ballarat. I think, my theory is that post Federation, in short, the Australian community and historians, abetted and abided in this process, wanted a nation-building story that didn't involve Aboriginal people, that they were an embarrassment to us because we would have to own up, we would have to grow up and acknowledge the aggressive way that they were invaded and colonized and oppressed, and we didn't want to do that. And I would argue we're still coming out of that funk.
Just another question from the chat, Fred. Can you comment on Aboriginal people joining the gold rush from other places such as Tasmania?
Well, that was one of the more, I was constantly surprised, doing this research. I found an Aboriginal family, buying, sort of paying their own way from Tasmania to come to the Goldfields and join in the rush for gold. I found Aboriginal people from Queensland, New South Wales, Western Australia, and South Australia coming to the gold rush in Victoria. Now, what really shocked my boots is I also found quite a few instances of Aboriginal people from Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland going to the Californian gold diggings in 1849. We're not talking about a passive, sort of community that, just accepted the colonial oppression. They were active participants. Some of them were active participants. Many of them, I would argue, were active participants in the world epoch moments that were they were not, sort of just letting it glide by.
Another question from the chat, Fred. Is there much research or reference material for Aboriginal people around the goldfields at Artunga, Northern Territory?
That's my next project. I don't know.
Okay. And then another one, the role of Aboriginal women on the goldfields, were they a commodity?
Yeah, this is really tricky. It's tricky for a number of reasons. In that, in the 19th century, they certainly weren't as open about issues that such as sexuality that we are in the 21st century. So they used all these euphemisms to describe, not just sexuality, but all sorts of social issues that they were not too. They were sensitive about. And women in general were one could say oppressed. Would be a that's not to say that they too sort of rose above those barriers, but certainly the glass ceiling was a lot lower in the 19th century than it is in the 21st century. I think that's pretty clear to say. So the point I'm driving at is the women don't get, the Aboriginal women in particular, don't get spoken about nearly as much as the men. And when they are spoken about in the correspondence and the newspapers, it is very often in a derogatory manner. So the picture that we white male middle class historian in 21st century gets is, I think, a very skewed one, and it doesn't paint Aboriginal women in a very kind light at all. Sadly, we don't know the full picture, is what I'm saying.
Just another question from the chat. There's been lots of interest in the idea espoused by Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu that a common or dominant understanding of history is disrupted by the evidence available in historical artefacts, such as images or the journals of explorers. Do you have a comment to make about this trajectory of historical inquiry? Does your work support this kind of disruptive notion?
Absolutely. People like Gamage and Pascoe and others have been at the forefront of a new renaissance of Australian history writing, and I'm a big fan of it myself. I think it has the sorts of things that Gamage and Pascoe have been sort of bringing to the general populace in such a terrific way. Has been known by historians in general for decades and decades. We just haven't had the brilliance, I suppose, to highlight it to the general community as well as what writers such as they have.
Anyone else? Any questions that they want to ask live or in the chat?
Yeah, can I ask one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Fred, it's Amos here.
Hey, Amos.
How you going?
Good, mate.
Yeah, I did a presentation with you in Ballarat a few years ago, me and Mick Burke.
I remember well.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't forget a good mate. Just a quick question: how much consultation, like with traditional owners, have you had over all these books that you and Ian have made famously? Has there been much interaction with them? Has it just been with specific sort of people and family groups to get the information, I guess?
Yes. It's a tricky issue. Well, not shying away.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Brad.
No, it's a good question to ask, actually. When the history writing has changed so quickly, sort of, I remember starting off 20 years ago and going to what was then the co-ops, because the
medical co-ops,
legislation wasn't in, and they were encouraging us to to go out and publish these stories. And then in about 2006, 2010, the political environment changed considerably. And so we then, historians like myself and Ian Clark and others, then embarked on a consultative process, which we were keen to do, had done in the past, and now doing with new, the new custodians, if you like, the TOs that were appointed in various areas.
Yeah.
So in short, yes, it has been. It's been difficult to be honest, as a white historian, to know who to consult with and who to ask for information. But generally, I've taken the perspective, rightly or wrongly, that if I consult purely with the non-Indigenous sources, having sort of give that I would try to, a bit like Bruce Pascoe has done, in that just try to convince the white community that in our own records, in the white fellas' records, that the clear evidence of Aboriginal participation and involvement in the wider Australian history really clearly existed. That's what I saw my role as doing, is almost focusing exclusively, purposely, on just the white fellas' records.
Yeah, no, that's where the documentation's at, because we're oral history people and we don't document stuff. But I think now, like coming into 21st century, I think that's what you'll realise, that people are starting to document stuff and they are going back into them records and rewriting history. And most Aboriginals, when they read history, they can see the racism and they can spot the lie and spot the real and spot the fake. And that's what they do when they read history. But I applaud you and people like Ian that do that research. But I just think that more collaboration with traditional owners, especially like myself, that are hungry, that have been researching themselves genealogy for like 10 to 15 years, and being a land manager on country. I just feel that there could be a lot more goodness comes out of it, and the whole community gets better outcomes from it, the environment and the social outcomes of it. But keep going. I love what you do. It's an honour to have people like you to research our history and document stuff the way you want to document stuff. But Aboriginals got their own way of perceptions and
well, that's what I've been told. It's by several aunties in particular, and some of the uncles as well. That good on you, Fred. But when we want to write our history, we'll do it our way. So keep on doing it your way, and we'll do it our way when we're good and ready. Is the message we got from quite a few community members.
Yeah, but I think like we can obviously utilise people like yourself that are and Ian and Bruce and Bill Gamage and all these great historians that really uplift Aboriginal involvement in the way society is today. And I just think that we don't get enough acknowledgement of the stuff that we have contributed to society. I think that's a big misconception amongst, you know, the wider community about Aboriginal people not, you know, contributing to the whole ethos of the Australian community. And really we have in many ways, like particularly the barbecue. That's number one. You know, like we invented the barbecue. You know, you know. Sitting by the river, you know, throwing a line in, having fire going, and you know, like
Yeah.
But I'll get in contact with you, and we'll have to have a chat and talk about that book and write a real good book, I reckon.
I'm always open to that.
Thanks, mate. Ciao.
Ciao.
Amos, is there anything else you'd like to say about things you'd like white Gabba historians to do in terms of consultation, whether that's students, you know, historians?
Yeah, I don't know. I've been around Australia the last probably year, and just talking with all traditional owners from Pintinjara to the fire people up in Cairns to the you know, people in New South Wales, and they've all got the same agenda, and the same story gets out, is that we just don't get acknowledged enough for the traditional ecological knowledge that we actually have, and how we can help this environment and help everybody. And I think the environment for our people is that because we're so disconnected from country and we've got no place to go, no home, that's why we get trapped up in the Western worlds and the Western ways, and we have no connection to country, and we don't have that authority to go and care for that country because we don't actually own that country. And especially in Victoria, you know, like all around Australia, up in Queensland, I think, you know, 70% of the country is owned by Aboriginal people. Northern Territory, you know, 70% is probably owned by them. Western Australia is probably the same, whereas Victoria is the only place that doesn't actually own a big swat of land, and we've got the most people, so it's really hard for us to practice our culture. And I think that, like, going around Australia, they've just really started to work out, and I think each group individually has got their sort of own working, how you work with them, as far as like you know, like as far as what they want out of it. And I think they're really starting to really come around now. Like I'm doing an archaeological dig in Bort, which is actually my clan country, and just the whole process has been really engaging, and they've really come to us. And at any time, and this is the thing, I think, at any time that we don't feel culturally safe, that we can just pull the plug and say, no, we don't feel safe, and we don't want to have anything that we've said recorded, and that should be the way it be, and not people just taking our information and, you know, creating PhDs and becoming doctors and scientists off Aboriginal information that has been taught to them, that they've, you know, been entrusted to from that community. And I think that, you know, the archaeological world and the writers of the world are really starting to come around, because the internet has brought the world so close that everyone's scrutinised now, that, you know, you can't get away with doing the wrong thing. And I think that, you know, it's a good thing for First Nations people all across the world, that they can actually be acknowledged for the knowledge that they actually can give to, you know. And we're all about educating everybody and everybody benefiting. It's not just the Aboriginal community, it's the whole Australia. And, you know, yous are on our country now, and we have made you our family, so our history is your history now. So if you don't embrace our history and our culture, then you're denying your own history and your own culture. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for that.
Thanks for that, Amos.
Okay, Mark.
Now we're at 6:31, and I'm aware that many of you have to leave in terms of starving children and all that thing. But we will just extend for a couple of minutes. So just a question from the chat. Surely there was a reaction from the local Aborigines when sacred lands were desecrated. What evidence did you find of this, and how was it reported?
Yeah, there was there were definitely Aboriginal people that were appalled, and we have quite a few records of Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal members declaring to whites on repeated occasions that to get off their terrain, this, and declaring, this is all my country, this is, sort of. And so the response that they got was similar to the ones that you would think in that sadly sort of in colonial period, where they were not acknowledged for their having their country. So yeah, the Goldfields period is a both a it's enigmatic in that it's both a positive story and a very negative story in the same breath. That there was an extraordinary amount of dislocation that occurred to Aboriginal communities right across Victoria, both environmental degradation at a massive level, social dislocation, and yeah, they were between a rock and a hard place, and they made extraordinary strides in asserting their sovereignty on many occasions.
Okay, well, we might leave it there. So if you could join me in thanking Fred very much for a really engaging presentation. And just for those of you who would like to, a very different topic, but next month on Thursday, the 3rd of September, Charles Fay will be talking about housing the diggers, home and housing on the Goldfields, 1857 to 1915. And if you want to be added to the Discovering History email list, just email me r.ford@latrobe.edu.au. So thanks very much for attending, and particularly for the fantastic questions and comments. That's been really valuable. So thanks very much, and look forward to seeing you next month online.
Terrific. Thanks, Ruth.